Imagine walking into a room where everyone is talking, debating, competing for attention. Voices are loud, egos are louder. Then one person enters quietly. They don't interrupt. They don't raise their voice. They simply stand there, calm, observant, unbothered. Within seconds, something strange happens. The room begins to settle. People glance in their direction. Conversations slow down. No one knows exactly why, but the energy shifts. Authority has entered the room without a single word being spoken. This is the kind of power most people never learn to recognize. We are taught that power is aggressive, vocal, dominant. We associate leadership with command and control. But the truth is far more unsettling. The strongest form of power is invisible. It doesn't demand obedience, it attracts it. It doesn't argue, it influences. And by the time you realize it's controlling you, you're already responding to it. This is the psychology of silent authority, a force that shapes decisions, emotions, and behavior without confrontation. A power so subtle that people mistake it for coincidence, intuition, or choice. In this chapter, you'll uncover how silent authority works, why the human brain submits to it naturally, and how it is used, both ethically and manipulatively, to control social dynamics, relationships, and leadership hierarchies. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The psychology of silent authority, how power works without words. Silent authority is influence without confrontation. It is power that does not need permission, explanation, or validation. Unlike loud dominance, which forces obedience through fear or pressure, silent authority pulls people in naturally. It feels calm. It feels stable. It feels trustworthy. And that is precisely why it is so effective. The human brain is not designed to respond primarily to logic. It responds to signals. Long before humans developed language, survival depended on reading behavior. Who stayed calm during danger? Who panicked? Who reacted emotionally? These signals determined who was followed and who was ignored. Even today, these ancient instincts guide our social behavior more than we realize. When someone remains composed under pressure, the brain interprets that calmness as competence. When someone does not overreact, the brain assumes control. This process happens instantly and subconsciously. People don't think this person is powerful. They feel it. Silent authority operates at this level, beneath conscious thought. One of the most important elements of silent authority is emotional regulation. Most people give away power the moment they become emotionally reactive. They defend themselves too quickly. They explain too much. They justify their decisions. In doing so, they signal insecurity. Silent authority works in the opposite way. It withholds emotional reactions. It stays centered. And that restraint creates psychological dominance. Silence itself is deeply uncomfortable for most people. When conversation pauses, anxiety rises. People rush to fill the gap because silence feels like judgment. The person who can sit comfortably in silence reverses the dynamic. Others begin to speak more, reveal more, and expose their intentions. Silence becomes a pressure tool, and the one who controls it controls the interaction. Non-reaction is one of the most powerful behaviors in social psychology. When someone tries to provoke a response and fails, they lose leverage. Emotional reactions transfer control to the other person. Calmness takes it back. This is why experienced negotiators, leaders, and manipulators rarely react immediately. They let others exhaust themselves emotionally while they remain steady. Status is another critical component of silent authority. True status is never claimed, it is assumed. The moment someone tries to prove their importance, they lower it. High-status individuals behave as though respect is already expected. They don't ask for approval. They don't over-expect. This expectation subtly pressures others to adjust their behavior accordingly. Body language plays a major role in communicating silent authority. Slow movements suggest confidence. Relaxed posture signals security. Strong but calm eye contact shows presence. Pauses in speech indicate thoughtfulness, not uncertainty. These cues are processed faster than words and often override them completely. A person may speak logically, but if their body language shows anxiety, their message loses power. Silent authority also works through perceived choice. Instead of issuing direct commands, it frames outcomes in a way that feels voluntary. The person believes they are choosing freely, but the options have already been shaped. This bypasses resistance because the human brain resists force, not guidance. When people feel in control, they comply more willingly. Aggressive authority triggers defense mechanisms. When people feel pressured or threatened, their nervous system shifts into fight or flight mode. Even if they obey, resentment builds. Silent authority avoids this reaction entirely. It feels safe, calm, and rational, which makes it far more effective over time. In leadership, silent authority creates loyalty instead of fear. People trust calm leaders because stability feels protective. Chaos repels. Composure attracts. This is why the quietest person in the room often holds the most influence. They are not competing for attention. They are observing, deciding, and positioning themselves strategically. However, silent authority has a dark side. In manipulative contexts, it is used to create emotional dependency and imbalance, withholding attention, remaining unpredictable, and controlling emotional availability can cause others to seek approval obsessively. The more someone adjusts their behavior to regain connection, the more power the silent authority figure gains. This is commonly seen in toxic relationships. One person stays emotionally distant and controlled, while the other becomes anxious and reactive. Over time, the reactive person loses confidence and autonomy. The manipulator never raises their voice. They never demand obedience. Yet control is firmly established. Understanding silent authority is not about becoming manipulative. It is about becoming aware. Awareness breaks unconscious influence. When you recognize the signs, emotional restraint, comfort with silence, lack of over-explanation, you stop mistaking power for coincidence. Once you understand how silent authority works, you can reclaim control over your own responses. You stop reacting emotionally. You become comfortable with pauses. You speak intentionally instead of impulsively. And gradually, your presence begins to carry weight without effort. True power is not loud. It does not rush. It does not beg for validation. It simply exists, and others adjust around it. Think about the last decision you regret. It probably didn't happen because you lacked intelligence. It happened because, in that moment, logic went silent and emotion took control. You felt urgency, fear, excitement, guilt, pressure, and before your rational mind could catch up, the decision was already made. This is not weakness. This is human wiring. The human brain does not make decisions logically first. It reacts emotionally first, then justifies logically later. And the people who understand this don't argue with facts. They don't debate logic. They press emotional buttons, quietly, precisely, instantly. In this chapter, you'll uncover the emotional triggers that bypass rational thinking completely. Triggers so powerful that they override intelligence, values, and even Once activated, these triggers push people to comply, trust, attach, and obey, often against their own better judgment. Understanding these mechanisms is the difference between being controlled emotionally and being mentally untouchable. Emotional triggers that override logic. How minds are manipulated. Instantly, human beings like to believe they are rational decision makers. We tell ourselves that we analyze situations carefully, weigh pros and cons, and act logically. In reality, this belief is an illusion. Neuroscience has repeatedly shown that emotions drive decisions, while logic is used afterward to justify them. The emotional brain reacts faster than the rational brain. When a trigger is activated, the limbic system takes over before the prefrontal cortex has time to evaluate consequences. This is why emotional manipulation is so effective. It does not ask for permission. It bypasses reasoning entirely. One of the strongest emotional triggers is fear. Fear narrows attention and accelerates decisions. When fear is activated, the brain's primary goal becomes safety, not truth. This is why fear-based messaging is so persuasive. It creates urgency and reduces critical thinking. People act quickly to escape discomfort, even if the solution offered is flawed. Closely tied to fear is the fear of loss. Psychologically, humans experience loss more intensely than gain. Losing something feels worse than gaining the same thing feels good. Manipulators exploit this by framing situations around what you might lose rather than what you might gain. Once loss is perceived, rational analysis collapses. Another powerful trigger is scarcity. When something feels limited, rare, or about to disappear, desire intensifies. Scarcity creates pressure. It tells the brain that delay equals danger. This is why limited time offers, emotional withdrawal, and unpredictable availability are so effective. The mind focuses on securing access rather than evaluating value. Guilt is another emotion that overrides logic effortlessly. When guilt is triggered, the brain seeks relief. The fastest way to relieve guilt is compliance. Manipulators don't need to accuse directly. They imply disappointment. They suggest sacrifice. They position themselves as victims. The target complies not because it makes sense, but because it feels necessary to restore emotional balance. Closely related to guilt is the sense of obligation. Humans are conditioned to repay favors, kindness, and attention. When someone gives first time, empathy, support, it creates psychological debt. Even if the favor was small or strategic, the obligation feels real. This makes people say yes when they want to say no. Validation is another deeply rooted emotional trigger. People crave approval, recognition, and acceptance. When validation is given inconsistently, it becomes addictive. The brain releases dopamine in unpredictable reward patterns. This is why inconsistent praise, attention, or affection creates stronger attachment than consistent treatment. Emotional triggers are especially effective when combined. Fear mixed with scarcity, guilt mixed with obligation, validation mixed with withdrawal. These combinations overwhelm rational processing. The brain becomes emotionally flooded, leaving little space for logical evaluation. Manipulators often present themselves as calm and reasonable, while activating emotional chaos in others. This imbalance creates control. The emotionally reactive person seeks stability, while the calm person appears authoritative. Over time, the reactive person begins to rely on the manipulator for emotional regulation. Triggers also work through identity. When someone's self-image is threatened or affirmed, logic becomes secondary. If a message challenges who you believe you are, intelligent, loyal, kind, strong, it creates emotional discomfort. People will act irrationally to protect their identity. Another overlooked trigger is uncertainty. The brain hates not knowing. When information is incomplete or inconsistent, anxiety increases. People then become more This is why vague communication, mixed signals, and unanswered questions can be controlling. The mind fills gaps emotionally, not logically. Emotional manipulation does not require lies. It requires timing. Truth delivered at the wrong emotional moment can still mislead. Logic delivered during emotional activation will be ignored. This is why arguing with someone who is emotional rarely works. Their brain is not in a receptive state. Understanding emotional triggers is not about using them against others. It is about recognizing when they are being used against you. Awareness slows down reaction time. It creates a pause between trigger and response, and that pause is where control returns. Once you recognize fear, guilt, scarcity, and validation triggers in real time, their power weakens. You stop reacting automatically. You question urgency. You evaluate motives. You regain access to logic. Emotional intelligence is not about suppressing emotions. It is about understanding their influence. When you know which emotions override your reasoning, you stop making decisions in emotional captivity. True psychological strength comes from this awareness. The ability to feel without surrendering control. The ability to pause while others rush. The ability to choose logic after emotion, not instead of it. Think about the last time you agreed to something you didn't want to do. You probably knew it would drain your time, energy, or peace. You probably felt uncomfortable saying yes, yet somehow the words still left your mouth. Not because you were convinced, but because refusing felt worse than agreeing. This is not kindness. This is psychological pressure. Guilt and obligation are two of the most powerful invisible forces controlling human behavior. They don't threaten you. They don't shout. They don't force compliance openly. Instead, they make resistance feel immoral. They turn self-protection into selfishness. And once these emotions take hold, logic becomes irrelevant. In this chapter, you'll uncover how guilt and obligation traps are created, why emotionally intelligent people fall into them, and how manipulators use moral pressure to control decisions quietly. Once you understand this mechanism, you'll recognize it instantly, and you'll never agree to something against your will without awareness again. The guilt and obligation trap. Why people say yes when they want to say no. Human beings are social by nature, and survival has always depended on cooperation. Because of this, the brain is wired to avoid rejection and maintain group harmony. Guilt and obligation evolved as emotional tools to keep communities functioning. Unfortunately, what once protected us is now easily exploited. Guilt arises when we feel we have violated a moral or social expectation. Obligation arises when we feel indebted to someone. Together, they form a psychological cage. When activated, the mind focuses on relieving emotional discomfort rather than evaluating what is fair or healthy. Manipulators understand this instinctively. They don't need to pressure directly. They imply sacrifice. They highlight their effort. They position themselves as having done something for you. Once that framing is established, refusal feels wrong, even when compliance harms you. One of the most common guilt triggers is emotional comparison. Phrases like, "After everything I've done for you," or "I would do it for you," shift focus away from the actual request and toward moral debt. The brain stops asking, "Do I want this?" and starts asking, "What kind of person would say no?" Another tactic is victim positioning. When someone frames themselves as tired, overwhelmed, or struggling, it creates emotional pressure. Even if they never ask directly, the implied expectation becomes clear. The listener complies to avoid feeling heartless. Not because the request is reasonable. Obligation also grows through small favors. When someone gives time, attention, or kindness early on, it creates psychological debt. This debt feels real, even if it was never requested. Over time, the recipient feels pressure to repay, often in disproportionate ways. Cultural conditioning strengthens these traps. Many people are taught that saying no is rude, selfish, or ungrateful. Boundaries are portrayed as cruelty. Sacrifice is praised. As a result, people learn to prioritize others' comfort over their own well-being. The guilt trap is especially effective on empathetic individuals. People who care deeply about others are more vulnerable because they feel emotions more intensely. Manipulators exploit this by appealing to empathy rather than logic. Another powerful technique is moral framing. Instead of asking directly, the manipulator frames the request as the right thing to do. Once morality enters the conversation, logic exits. Disagreeing feels like a character flaw rather than a preference. Guilt also works through anticipation. People often comply not because they feel guilty now, but because they anticipate feeling guilty later. This future emotional discomfort outweighs present resistance, leading to compliance before the guilt even appears. Obligation traps often deepen over time. The more you comply, the harder it becomes to stop. Each yes reinforces the pattern. The manipulator's expectations increase, while your autonomy decreases. Eventually, saying no feels impossible without emotional fallout. This dynamic is common in toxic relationships, workplaces, and family systems. One person constantly gives, the other constantly expects. Yet the giver feels guilty for wanting balance. This inversion of responsibility is the core of the trap. The most dangerous aspect of guilt and obligation is that they disguise themselves as virtue. People believe they are being kind, loyal, or generous, when in reality they are being controlled. True generosity comes from choice, not pressure. Breaking free begins with awareness. Guilt does not mean you are wrong. Discomfort does not mean you owe someone. A request does not become an obligation simply because emotions are involved. Learning to pause is critical. When guilt appears, stop and ask, is this responsibility truly mine? Would I agree if guilt were removed? Am I choosing this or escaping discomfort? Healthy boundaries do not make you cold. They make relationships honest. People who respect you will accept your no. Those who punish you for it reveal their intentions. The moment you stop equating compliance with goodness, the trap loses power. You reclaim the right to decide without emotional coercion. True strength is not in endless giving. It is in conscious choice. And when guilt no longer controls you, your yes becomes meaningful again. Imagine someone suddenly becoming distant. Messages slow down. attention disappears. Certainty turns into silence. Nothing aggressive happens, yet anxiety begins to grow inside you. You replay conversations. You wonder what changed. You feel the urge to fix something, even though nothing was clearly broken. This is not coincidence. This is psychology. Fear, scarcity, and loss are among the most powerful emotional forces shaping human behavior. They do not push, they pull. They don't command, they pressure from within. When the brain senses loss or limitation, it panics quietly and starts making decisions based on survival rather than reason. In this chapter, you will uncover how scarcity and fear are deliberately created to control attention, attachment, loyalty, and compliance. You'll learn why the threat of losing something is more powerful than the promise of gaining it, and how this invisible pressure is used in relationships, leadership, marketing, and manipulation. Once you understand this mechanism, urgency will stop controlling you. Scarcity, fear, and loss, the dark science behind emotional control. The human brain is designed to prioritize survival over logic. When faced with potential loss, rational thinking takes a back seat. This is not weakness, it is biology. Fear and loss activate ancient survival circuits that evolved long before modern reasoning existed. Psychologically, loss is more painful than gain is pleasurable. Studies consistently show that losing something creates stronger emotional reactions than gaining the same thing. This phenomenon, known as loss aversion, explains why fear-based influence is so effective. The brain is not trying to optimize happiness. It is trying to avoid pain. Scarcity amplifies desire by creating urgency. When something feels limited, rare, or uncertain, its perceived value increases instantly. The brain assumes that what is scarce must be important. This shortcut saves time in survival situations, but it also makes humans highly manipulable. Scarcity does not need to be real to be effective. The perception alone is enough. When access becomes unpredictable, attention intensifies. This is why inconsistent availability creates stronger attachment than constant presence. The brain begins to chase certainty. In emotional contexts, scarcity is often created through withdrawal. Attention that was once freely given becomes limited. Affection becomes conditional. Communication becomes inconsistent. The target begins to feel a sense of impending loss. Even if nothing has been stated directly, fear of loss activates anxiety, and anxiety narrows focus. When anxious, people stop evaluating situations broadly. They fixate on regaining safety. This makes them more compliant, more forgiving, and more willing to compromise their boundaries. Manipulators rarely threaten openly. Instead, they let the fear grow internally. Silence replaces reassurance. Distance replaces clarity. The lack of explanation forces the mind to fill gaps, emotionally rather than logically. Scarcity also operates through time pressure. When decisions are framed as urgent, critical thinking weakens. The brain prioritizes speed over accuracy. People act quickly to avoid missing out, often regretting decisions later. This tactic is widely used beyond relationships in marketing, leadership, and power dynamics. Limited time offers, exclusive access, and countdowns exploit the same psychological mechanism. The fear is not of missing a deal, but of losing opportunity. Fear also strengthens authority. When people feel uncertain, they seek guidance. The person who appears calm during chaos becomes influential. This is why crises elevate certain leaders. Stability becomes valuable when fear is widespread. However, fear-based control creates dependency. When someone controls access to reassurance, safety, or validation, others begin to rely on them emotionally. Over time, the fear of losing that source becomes stronger than the relationship itself. Loss does not need to happen to be powerful. Anticipated loss is often worse. The brain reacts to imagined outcomes almost as strongly as real ones. This is why people tolerate unhealthy dynamics. They fear what might happen if they leave more than what is happening now. Scarcity also distorts. When attention is limited, people internalize the lack. They assume they must earn access. This shifts the power balance. The one withholding becomes the evaluator. The one seeking becomes subordinate. The most dangerous aspect of scarcity-based control is that it feels personal. People believe the anxiety they feel is about love, loyalty, or value. In reality, it is a neurological response to uncertainty. Breaking free requires slowing down. Urgency is the enemy of clarity. When fear appears, pause. Ask whether the pressure is external or internal. Ask who benefits from your anxiety. Not all scarcity is manipulation. Real limitations exist, but healthy dynamics include clarity, consistency, and choice. When fear replaces communication, control replaces connection. Once you recognize how fear, loss, and scarcity hijack the brain, you stop chasing certainty blindly. You regain the ability to choose rather than react. And when urgency no longer controls you, your decisions regain their power. If manipulation were obvious, it wouldn't work. No one would fall for it if control came with warnings, labels, or clear instructions. The most effective manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation at all. It feels like emotion, like urgency, like guilt, like attraction, like choice. By the time most people realize they are being influenced, the damage is already done. Decisions have been made. Boundaries have been crossed. Power has shifted quietly. And the most dangerous part is this: many people never realize it at all. This chapter is not about becoming colder or distrustful. It is about becoming mentally protected. Because once you understand how manipulation works, your mind becomes harder to access without your permission. Awareness is the only real defense. And when you learn how to pause, observe, and respond instead of react, invisible control loses its grip completely. Psychological defense: how to protect your mind from invisible manipulation. Manipulation only works when it remains unseen. The moment influence becomes visible, it begins to weaken. Psychological defense is not about fighting manipulation directly. It is about removing the conditions that allow it to operate. The first and most important defense is you cannot protect your mind if you don't understand your own emotional patterns. Everyone has triggers: fear, guilt, validation, attachment, urgency. Manipulation succeeds when it activates these triggers faster than conscious thought can intervene. The goal of psychological defense is not to suppress emotion, but to slow down reaction time. Speed favors manipulation. Pauses favor clarity. When you create even a small gap between stimulus and response, control begins to return to you. One of the strongest defensive skills is emotional labeling. When you name what you are feeling: anxiety, pressure, guilt, excitement, the emotional brain loses intensity. The rational brain re-engages. This simple act disrupts unconscious influence. Another critical defense is detachment from urgency. Manipulation thrives on immediacy. Now or never. This is your only chance. Decide quickly. Urgency collapses reasoning. When you delay a decision, even briefly, emotional intensity fades and logic regains control. Learning to tolerate discomfort is also essential. Many people comply not because they want to, but because they want emotional discomfort to stop. Silence, disapproval, distance, or tension feels unbearable. Manipulators rely on this intolerance. When you learn to sit with discomfort without acting, their leverage disappears. Boundaries are another core defense. A boundary is not an explanation. It is not a debate. It is a limit. Manipulation increases when boundaries are weak, negotiable, or inconsistent. Clear boundaries reduce access to emotional influence. Importantly, you do not need to justify boundaries emotionally. Over-explaining weakens them. The more you defend a boundary, the more it sounds optional. Psychological strength comes from stating limits calmly and standing by them. Another defensive layer is pattern recognition. Manipulation rarely happens once. It repeats. Inconsistency, guilt-inducing language, emotional withdrawal, pressure disguised as care. These are patterns, not accidents. When you recognize patterns instead of isolated events, clarity replaces confusion. Reducing dependency is also vital. The more you rely on one person for validation, security, or identity, the easier it is for them to control you. Psychological independence does not mean isolation. It means balance. Multiple sources of support reduce emotional vulnerability. Silence can also be used defensively. Not every statement deserves a response. Not every provocation requires engagement. When you stop reacting automatically, you regain control of the interaction. Silence removes fuel from manipulation. Another overlooked defense is manipulation often works by making people doubt their perceptions. You're overthinking, you're too sensitive. Over time, people begin to outsource their judgment. Rebuilding trust in your own interpretation of reality is essential. Clarity beats confrontation. You don't need to accuse manipulators or expose them dramatically. Awareness alone changes behavior. When manipulation stops working, it often stops being attempted. Psychological defense also requires accepting loss. Sometimes protecting your mind means losing access, connection, or approval. This is uncomfortable, but necessary. No external relationship is worth internal captivity. The strongest defense is emotional regulation. When you can feel without being controlled by feeling, influence loses power. Calmness is not passivity, it is control. True mental strength is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not argue endlessly. It observes, pauses, and chooses intentionally. This is the opposite of manipulation. It is sovereignty. When you master psychological defense, you stop being pulled into invisible games. You stop chasing certainty, approval, or relief. You become grounded. And when you are grounded, manipulation has nowhere to attach. Power does not belong to those who control others. It belongs to those who control themselves.